Take the floor, Zoe.
Okay. Hi, guys. Welcome to our country tour to South Africa Part 2. My name is Zoe Adams, and I'm a business finance major, and I work with international programs to bring you events like this one. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker who has been living in Africa for the past 10 years, Miss Brittany Smith. Brittany, right?
Hi, hello, hi everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's nice to be able to join you today. I'd like to share my screen, so let me just go ahead and do that. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so I'm hoping you all can see that. Can everyone see my screen right now? Just give me a nod. Yes. Okay, great. So welcome to South Africa. I'm so excited to be joining you for this country tour. I think this is such a great idea and such a nice way for us to try and pivot in these really complicated times when it's hard to know when we'll be able to get on a plane again. It's nice to be able to have the opportunity to learn about a place and sort of visit virtually. So let me introduce myself. As Zoe shared, my name is Brittany. I'm currently the resident director for South Africa programs for Arcadia University, so the College of Global Studies at Arcadia University. And my relationship with South Africa started when I was a student. When I was an undergraduate student, I studied 2 semesters abroad. My first semester was in Rome, Italy, and my second semester was in Cape Town, South Africa. And that experience for me was really transformative. I learned so much about myself and so much about the world. And I feel really grateful to be able to have had that opportunity while I was an undergrad. And the experience in South Africa was so really life-changing and transformative that I decided to come back. And so after I graduated from college, I worked for a little bit in New York, and then I returned to South Africa where I did a master's and then my PhD, both in English literature, and then went on to continue living in South Africa. So that's where I currently reside full-time. So it is winter in South Africa. I think that's the first very important thing for you to know. So for those of you who are in a nice, warm, summery climate, it has been extremely cold in Cape Town, and my family in the US, I grew up in New York. So people always say that it can't possibly be anything like New York. And it isn't. The cold is definitely different, but it's still cold, you know? I think when you're really hot, you're not thinking about, oh, well, it's not as hot as so-and-so. No, all you're thinking about is the fact that it's really hot right now. So that is how I feel definitely about Cape Town's winter. So I guess just another additional little tidbit about the winter in Cape Town is that we don't really do indoor heating here in South Africa. So there's not central heating in the same way that there is in a lot of wintry places in the US. So that means that when it's cold outside, it's cold inside. So thank goodness for the space heaters that help to keep us a little bit warm. But today, what I'm hoping to do is to give you a brief introduction to South Africa. No country can be done justice in, sort of like a 30-minute conversation. And I would say least of all a country like South Africa, which is so full of depth and diversity and has such a really complex history. So I just want to share with you some important highlights, some things that stick out to me, and some of my favorite things to give you all a little bit of a taste. So let me start off by introducing sort of South Africa on a macro level. I'll start with South Africa by the numbers. I decided to look into the size of South Africa because I thought, oh, well, maybe that'll be useful comparatively. And I found out that South Africa is roughly twice the size of Texas. So I think that's a nice way of wrapping your head around it. It takes about 20 hours to drive from the southernmost tip to the northernmost tip. So to drive from Cape Town down here at the bottom to Musina. So that gives you a sense of the overall size of the place. And South Africa has 9 provinces. So each of the different colored regions on the map that you're looking at represents a different province. So there is the Western Cape, the Eastern Cape, the Northern Cape, Northwest, the Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, Mpumalanga, and Limpopo. So those are the 9 provinces of South Africa. And another important tidbit I think that's really good to know is that within the nation, there are 2 independent nations within the borders of South Africa. So those are Eswatini, those are the gray spaces in the middle of the map there, and Lesotho. And both of those small landlocked nations are monarchies run by a king. So there's a king of Lesotho and a king of Eswatini. And they, along with the neighboring countries of Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe and Zambia just above, and Mozambique are some of the beautiful countries that you can also visit from South Africa. So I think one of the things that people don't really, or often aren't aware of, is the fact that South Africa is just sort of a great central point from which to visit the rest of Southern Africa. So while I was a study abroad student, I had that spring break period in the middle of my semester, and I took advantage of that time to go on one of those trips that local tour operators will organize to visit other countries in the region. And so I went to Zambia and Botswana on a 10-day overland trip. So it was camping the whole way, and was definitely my first time doing anything like that, but just helps you see how accessible the rest of Southern Africa is from this particular vantage point. So to get back to South Africa, the country has 3 different capital cities, which I think is very different than a lot of places. There's an executive capital, which is Pretoria. There is the judicial capital, which is Bloemfontein, and the legislative capital, which is Cape Town. And then there close to the center, you'll see Johannesburg, which actually is not one of the official capitals, but sort of functions like an economic capital, so, or business capital, in the way that maybe people will see Manhattan as being like quite a central place in the United States, but also not being an official capital in any way. Thinking again about numbers, South Africa has 11 national languages. So I always use that as a really interesting way to point out the amount of cultural diversity that exists in this particular country. English is commonly spoken nationwide, so I don't have any trouble getting around speaking in English, and the students that I bring to South Africa to study here also don't have any trouble doing so because so many people are conversant in English. But you will find that there are many South Africans who speak multiple languages, many of the national languages. So I've met people, I actually met someone a week ago who said that he spoke, I think, 9 out of 11. So that is really amazing to think of people being that multilingual, to speak 9 different languages. An interesting fact about the languages is that many of them are similar. So there might be people who might be able to, while one might not be your official language, you can understand another one. Maybe you can't write it, but you can understand what someone is trying to say. And many people speak a separate, so they might speak English or Afrikaans, which is another South African language, in their workplace or at school, but have a different home language. So that's a language that they speak in their home environment. And the most commonly spoken home language is isiZulu. So that's the South African language. And the population is about 57 million people. So that again is just about twice the size of Texas. But the important fact there is that there are significantly more densely populated regions, like some of the metropolitan cities like Cape Town, Johannesburg, and Durban, and then you'll have other provinces that are far more or far less populated, like the Free State and the Northern Cape. So there are very, very rural communities, and then also really dense, highly populated cities. So I think one of the key points to take away from this presentation is that South Africa is extremely diverse. And speaking of that diversity, I wanted to share some of the demographics so that you can have a better understanding of what to expect. That, I think, is one of the big surprises that people have when they come to South Africa. We have many stereotypes about Africa, many of which are perpetuated by the media, and are they portray Africa to have a very particular demographic, to have a very particular landscape, and South Africa resists a lot of those expectations. So for one, I think people assume that a country in Africa would have a predominantly Black or solely Black population, actually, with a very small minority of other types of people. Whereas in fact, while South Africa is a majority Black country for sure, there is also quite a significant population of people who identify as colored, which is another racial designation here in South Africa. that a term that's essentially used to encapsulate people who do not cannot be easily identified as either Black or white. And there are many millions of white South Africans, and there is also a significant population of Indian and a slightly smaller population of Asian South Africans. So an interesting factoid there is that Durban, which is a city here in South Africa, has the largest population of Indians outside of India, anywhere in the world. So there's a very significant Indian influence, there's a large Indian population, and you can get lots of Indian food. And I think if you were to get on a plane and arrive in Durban, South Africa, and find that you're surrounded by plenty of Indian people, along with Black South Africans, of course, and people of other races, but to find such a significant Indian influence, I think is quite a surprise for people. So South Africa definitely is full of surprises. I think, especially if you're used to typical, stereotypical representations of Africa. In order to really, I think, understand any place, but a place like South Africa in particular, I think it's very important to be able to understand the historical context that has created the realities that we see today. So to give you a bit of the history of the region, I want to definitely start with the indigenous population. The indigenous population of South Africa is primarily made up of a group of peoples known as the Khoisan, and that is a collective term that's used to refer to the Khoi people and the San people. So they sort of encapsulated the two of those into the Khoisan. And they are considered to be some of the original people of this region. They are an ethnic group that's settled in parts of what is today considered to be South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana, so that southern part of Africa, by about 100,000 BC. So a very, very long time ago. And many of the remaining Khoi people, so I think as with indigenous people all over the world, there was a significant depopulation as a result of the colonial encounter, but many of the Khoi people who are still living in this region have been absorbed as part of that colored racial designation that I mentioned earlier, along with descendants of laborers and enslaved people brought from countries in the East Indies and Southeast Asia. So what is interesting about traveling to South Africa, I think especially as someone who is a person of color from another part of the world, is that you might very strongly identify as a Black person and have that as a very strong part of your identity. And then because of the way you look, or various phenotypical features, people might assume that you are colored in South Africa. So you might find yourself to be racially reclassified based off of the classification system that exists here. So I think that's always a very interesting social experiment for people to undergo, to find that you don't belong to the race that you think you do in a different context. So to go back into the historical context, over time, the Khoisan indigenous people, so those are the original people of the southernmost part of Africa, were joined by what are known as Nguni-speaking Africans, so people from who migrated from the northern, eastern, and central parts of Africa to the southern region. And those people are who I think are typically referred to as Black South Africans. So they have those phenotypical features that are associated with Black South Africans. And then the other parts of the population, the white South Africans, are descendants of European settlers, so mainly from England and from the Netherlands. So that's why Afrikaans, which is one of South Africa's national languages, has such a strong Dutch influence because of the settlers who came here, the colonizers from the Netherlands. And there are also, as I mentioned earlier, many South Africans of Southeast Asian or Indian or Chinese origin who are descendants of laborers and enslaved peoples who came here in the 19th and 20th century. So you have this vast racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. And I think what that basically means for me is that when people ask me, when I'm traveling or even when students come to study here, they ask, can you tell me a bit more of South African culture? And my answer to that is always, which South African culture? I think South African culture is not by any means homogenous, and I don't think any culture really is, right? And I say the same about American culture as well, is that there are many different American cultures. There are regional cultures, sometimes there are state cultures, racial cultures, but South Africa is considered to be, I think, one of the most multicultural nations on earth. But there are some things that I think can be seen as overarching cultural norms. And some of the ones that I want to point out today that have been a key factor of my own experience in South Africa is, for one, greeting people is considered to be imperative in South African culture. And I think for a lot of people, maybe especially people who come from the South, that doesn't seem like such a strange thing to say. But for example, for someone like me who grew up in New York, where you don't greet people unless you know them, it is definitely a cultural shift to feel that you have to, if you enter a room, for example, if you walk past people on the street, especially if you make eye contact, it's considered very disrespectful if you don't greet, if you don't say hello, and especially if you can't greet in that person's language, it's considered even more respectful. So that's one of the cultural norms that I've picked up on here, as well as there's a significant respect for the elderly. And I think that's one of the things that transcends all the South African cultures. And I think maybe some of you will be able to relate to that as well. But it's something that is very highly revered in South African cultures, to respect the elderly. And also there is in South African society a heightened racial consciousness. People are very hyper aware of racial identity, very hyper aware of the many different ways in which that manifests in our day-to-day lived existence. And I think that for different people, it's to different extents, and definitely for people of color more than others. But because of South Africa's history, there really is, it's very difficult to avoid racial identity and racial heritage. And on the screen here, this photo that I have on the right is actually a montage of different ways of greeting in different South African languages. So depending on what region you are, some languages, what region you're in, some languages are more prevalent in some regions than in others. So it's always nice to learn how to greet in the local languages that are spoken in the particular region that you're living in. So as I mentioned earlier about this factor of racial inequality, I think it's something that people can often gloss over when they're thinking about South Africa. But for me, I think it's one of, because it impacts every aspect of your lived experience, it's one of the aspects of South African society that I think you really have to highlight in order. And I always say that if you don't know much about racial dynamics in this context, then you're missing out on so much of the subtext of the conversations that you're participating in, even of the television shows that you're watching, of the news stories that you're reading. And I think that's probably everywhere, especially in the United States as well. But here in particular, you have to be really aware of the historical context that has created the South Africa that we see today. So because of the nation's legacy of apartheid, which was a system of legalized structural racism that existed officially between 1948 and 1994, but unofficially for many years before and many years after. For most South Africans, almost every aspect of your life is determined by your racial designation. So the language that you speak, the schools that you go to, where you live, the restaurants you eat in, and really all the resources that you have access to are determined by race. So that system of apartheid, the term is an Afrikaans term that means separateness or essentially segregation. And it went on for many years and still impacts the lived experience of South Africans today. And probably the most palpable expression of modern day apartheid is in residential segregation. So, or spatial segregation, which is depicted here on the screen using the cover of Time magazine. So this was the cover of Time magazine in May 2019, and it features two suburbs that are next to each other in Johannesburg, South Africa. And so you can see this extreme difference, the extreme disparity in wealth between the people on the right who are living in this very densely populated shack community and the people on the left who are just right across the street that are living in these palatial mansions with swimming pools and all of that. So that gives you a sense of the economic inequality that still persists in South Africa today. Most of South Africa's wealth and land still belongs to white South Africans, and the vast majority of Black South Africans still live in poverty as a result of the legacies of the various racist policies of apartheid. So that doesn't mean that there aren't wealthy Black South Africans, definitely not, and doesn't mean that there aren't middle-class Black South Africans, but it just means that the divide, it remains still very apparent. So I think that even for people who don't know much about South Africa at all, one of the things that most people have heard of is the system of apartheid and the fact that as a result of Nelson Mandela becoming president in 1994, that apartheid was formally abolished. And so when I was a study abroad student considering coming to South Africa, that was pretty much what I knew, and I was nervous about it. I was nervous about what that would mean for me as a student. Would I encounter overt racism? Would it be worse than what I'd experienced in the United States? You know, I had all of those questions. And even with those questions, I thought this was something that I wanted to know more about. It was something that I wanted to understand, especially because South Africa had what is considered to be a peaceful transition to democracy and seems to be moving towards an attempt at deracializing the society. And so I ventured, despite my sort of concerns about what that experience was going to be like, and I found it to be such an important learning experience for me personally. I must mention that generally visitors, especially American tourists, regardless of race, tend to be largely exempt from the day-to-day difficulties of modern day racism and segregation in South Africa because of all the privileges that come with being a tourist. So because of the US passport, because of the American accent, all of that makes it slightly easier, I think, for foreigners, for visitors, tourists to navigate the society. But nonetheless, because of, especially if you're a person of color, because of your racial affinity, you'll feel the burden of that inequality. But also, I think what for me was such an interesting learning experience was really looking at this comparatively, looking at the experience of South Africa, comparing it to racial discrimination in other parts of the world, especially in the United States. And in my experience, I found that it has actually turned out to be less different than I expected. I think South Africa is definitely an extreme case. And so because of how great the disparity is, it's so obvious and it's very difficult to ignore, but the comparison has taught me a lot about the global experience of Black oppression, about the many different global manifestations of white supremacy, but also so much about Black resilience and about the power that can come from the unity of people working against oppression. And so for me, the South African story is ultimately one of triumph. And so that's a really moving and encouraging, inspiring story for me personally. And then amidst all of that really heavy stuff is the fact that the country is just jaw-droppingly beautiful. I mean, in really any direction you turn in, any province that you're in, you'll find something that is just so stunningly beautiful. I mean, this is just a small sample of some of the beautiful, stunning landscapes that are available in South Africa. I think because I'm located in Cape Town, and Cape Town is such a mountainous region and it's so well known for its beautiful beaches, that's kind of what I always like to highlight, and that's that picture there in the top, in the middle. But the entire country, most of the country is coastal, so there's so many beaches, so many beautiful mountain landscapes. So for people who love to hike, for people who love to surf, for people who just love to be in the outdoors, South Africa is really such a perfect place to experience all of that. And I think what's great about it also is that you get to do that especially for people using a more valuable currency. It's relatively affordable. You know, you can go out and enjoy beautiful restaurants. You can go out and enjoy all of this natural beauty for a very low cost. So I think it's possible to have a very high standard of living here on a lower income than it is probably in the United States. And alongside all of that, you know, visual landscape diversity, there's also so much biodiversity and animal diversity, which I think is something that people often don't know about South Africa. It is actually ranked 6th out of the world's 17 mega diverse countries. So like I said, diversity is the word of the day here, but it has more than 20,000 different plants, which is about 10% of the planet's known species. So many people come here to study the biodiversity in this region because it's really unique. And then of course, there's also all of the animals that you can encounter here. people often wonder if you can go on safaris in South Africa, and the answer is yes, you can. You can go on safaris, especially in the center of the country, closer to Johannesburg. There's a large game reserve known as the Kruger National Park. And one of the main things to do when you're on a safari is to look for what they call the big five. So those are the 5 animals that you're trying to spot throughout your safari. And the big 5 are a lion, a leopard, a rhino, an elephant, and a buffalo. So you have to try and see all 5 of those in one safari. It's usually, I think a lot of people end up doing everything but the leopard, because that one is a very elusive creature and a bit hard to spot, especially in the daytime. So people often try and do a nighttime safari and a daytime safari so that they can get a bit of both. But I think the most important thing about South Africa is the people. I have experienced South African people to be extremely warm and welcoming. And like I mentioned before, that cultural diversity is just so interesting. There's so many different types of people and cultures to get to know. So pictured on the screen here in the top left is the Cape Carnival, which is an annual event that happens on the 2nd of January every year in Cape Town. And for people who are familiar with some of the carnivals in the Caribbean or maybe in New Orleans, you might be kind of have a glimpse into what that kind of experience can be like. But it's a really interesting South African take on that kind of annual tradition, and super beautiful, wonderful festive event. Here on the bottom left, that's the traditional dress of the Xhosa people of South Africa. In the center is the traditional Ndebele dress. Here on the top right is the Zulu king wearing traditional Zulu garments. And then here on the bottom right are traditional Sutu blankets. So the Sutu people wear these blankets to keep themselves warm when they're herding cattle. And so for those of you who are huge fans of Black Panther, you would remember these blankets as being the blankets that are worn by the warriors outside of, as they protect the perimeter of Wakanda. So that's just a little touch of South African culture making its way into Wakanda there. And of course, there's so much culinary diversity as a result of all of this diversity of the people. So I won't get into everything here, but this just gives you a sense of, because of the influence from the East, you've got Malay food, you've got Indian food, you've got a sort of a take on Western food with a sandwich called the Gatsby, which is very popular in the Western Cape, which is sort of like a Subway sandwich filled with all kinds of meats and cheeses and French fries and everything, and fish and chips. That's also from the British influence. South Africa is very well known for its braais. The word braai basically means barbecue or to grill meat, and that's one of those things that transcends all different cultures. Because of the perimeter being bordered by oceans, there's a strong seafood culture, as well as traditional staples for each of the different cultural groups, including biltong, which is basically like beef jerky, which is traditional food of considered to be traditional Afrikaans food. So I think that what is so exciting about all of that is that you can never run out of things to do or things to experience. So I've lived here for close to a decade, and I'm still learning new things all the time. And one of my favorite things to explore here in the Western Cape is the fact that I think maybe not so hidden secret about the Western Cape is that there are tons of wine farms that produce their own locally produced and therefore very affordable wine. And so wine tasting is a popular pastime, and I always recommend that people give it a try. Even if you don't like wine, it's nice just to be in the vineyard, to learn about the wine, learn about the different cultivars, and really get a sense of that particular industry, which is really so key to life here in South Africa. So that is basically all that I have time to share with you today. If you'd love to know more, please do check out the Instagram page for our Arcadia Center. It's at Arcadia South Africa, and to get a sense of some of Arcadia's larger programs, you can go to @Arcadia Nights Abroad. And that's where you can learn more about South Africa and about Arcadia programs. I'd love to know if anybody has any questions.
Any questions? Thank you so much, by the way, Brittany. Your presentation was beautiful.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Don't be shy.
I do have a few questions. Like when you showed the Time magazine and you talked about the inequality of the, I guess, indigenous South Africans. versus the white South Africans. Is there any poor to middle class South Africans there?
Well, of course, of course. You know, I think the middle class everywhere is shrinking, right? But there are definitely plenty of people who are living a sort of middle class life.
Mm-hmm.
But that disparity, which is, I think it's based off of the Gini index, which essentially indicates that there are a vast majority of people who are living in that's a very small top 5%, and then so many people who are earning below the so-called poverty line. But there are people who are really holding on to being middle class, but it's difficult. It's difficult because unemployment is quite high, so it's hard to get a job. And of course, the cost of living can be very challenging depending on your salary. So there are plenty of people, and I think that many of the middle class comforts like restaurants and plays and the movies, all those things that people, you know, are hoping to be able to enjoy, that's usually the middle class who are able to have access to all of that. But yes, there are middle class Black South Africans as well, which I think is an important undertold story about the continent in general. People often associate Black Africans with poverty, which I think is an unfair and unfortunate stereotype. So there are plenty of middle-class Black South Africans, but not nearly as much as there should be as a result of the apartheid legacy.
Great presentation, Brittany, and just super thorough in capturing, you know, the beauty and also the complexity of South Africa. And I have a question. It's not related to your presentation, but more so related to an industry. I'm hearing that the cinema industry is starting to boom in South Africa, specifically Cape Town. You know, a lot of shows are being starting to be filmed there. I know Nigeria is big and Nollywood is big in the film industry, but I know South Africa, a few shows are starting to come from South Africa. Have you noticed or heard about that as well?
Definitely, and I'm so glad that you mentioned that, Stephanie, because especially on Netflix, South Africa has recently come out with a couple of different Netflix series. There's one called Blood and Water. And if you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out because actually a large part of it, the school that's filmed there is actually the University of Cape Town. So it gives you a small glimpse of what the University of Cape Town looks like. And yeah, there's another one called Queen Sugar. So yes, you're right in saying that the local film industry is definitely booming. I think it's always been extremely prolific. There are many different local productions. I think it's just that now, thanks to kinds of sites like Netflix, which provide greater access, there's sort of this democratization. So more people can have access to the great productions that are coming out of South Africa, which I think is really exciting. So there have been plenty of local productions for many years. I think maybe less so on such a so-called international stage. And so it's nice to see that they're finally other people are getting access to the kinds of things that are being produced here. But I think an interesting fact about South Africa as well, because especially Cape Town in particular is so beautiful, but also the cost is so low, many movies are filmed here actually. So it's not unusual to run into celebrities in Cape Town who are here filming a movie or filming a TV series, because there's actually quite a booming film industry in South Africa that records productions for all of Europe and lots of different production companies in the US as well. So I'm looking forward to that being a larger part of the world's ability to access South Africa for sure.
All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us today. And I guess that wraps up today's country tour to South Africa. Thank you so much again, Brittany, for having this presentation with us.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, Brittany.
Thank you for having me.
You can finally get you some sleep now.
Yeah, it's bedtime now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.